Today we're going to learn about states of consciousness. Most of this chapter is about sleep, but we will touch on some other topics as well. Let's get started with defining consciousness. Consciousness is defined as our awareness of internal and external stimuli. So by internal stimuli, we mean things like pain, hunger, thirst, sleepiness, or being aware of your own thoughts and emotions. Whereas external stimuli are things like seeing the light from the sun, or feeling something, or hearing somebody's voice or a song. Noticing those things are external, awareness of external stimuli. So, of course, when you're awake, you notice things like hunger and thirst, and you might hear a song playing in the room. And when you're sleeping, you don't notice these things. So sleep is a state marked by relatively low levels of physical activity and reduced sensory awareness that is distinct from periods of rest that occur during wakefulness. Right? So sleep is its own thing, different than rest, and very low levels of physical activity. You're mostly just breathing, pumping your heart, that kind of stuff, and very reduced sensory awareness. Whereas wakefulness has high levels of sensory awareness, thought, and behavior. Of course, there are other states of consciousness, not just awake or asleep. As you can see in the picture, the girl on top is daydreaming. You may have experienced this where you are able to do something like drive a car or do your work or eat your dinner, but you're daydreaming the whole time and it barely feels like you're even conscious, right? You're not even really that aware of the situation, but it's different than sleeping. And then, of course, being under general anesthesia would be an even less conscious state than sleeping, right? It would take even more to wake you up and you hear or notice even less. All right, now that we've defined consciousness, let's talk a little bit about biological rhythms. There are a lot of very interesting studies about biological rhythms, particularly about rats. A biological rhythm is an internal rhythm of biological activity, something physiological going on in your body that follows a pattern or a rhythm. The book gives menstrual cycles as an example. This is a biological rhythm. A circadian rhythm in particular is a biological rhythm that takes place over about 24 hours. So our sleeping and wakefulness cycles as humans follow circadian rhythms. How does this work? Well, in the brain, the hypothalamus, which is right above the pituitary gland, is the main center of homeostasis, which is the tendency to maintain balance or optimal level within the biological system. And in the hypothalamus, part of your brain, is something called the SCN, or the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The SCN is basically like your brain's clock. It takes information from your eyes and from other parts of your body to keep track of the time of day and keep you on a schedule, basically. So when it's light out, the neurons in your retinas and your eyes send a message to your SCN saying it's daytime. And then when it's dark and you have very little amount of light hitting your retinas, the neurons in your eyes will send a message to your hypothalamus, letting your brain know that it's nighttime, it's time to rest. Now, part of the way that this is done, that your brain actually signals that it's time to sleep once the clock has been established, is with the hormone melatonin. Melatonin is an important regulator of sleep-wake cycles. It's released by the pineal gland, and it's a hormone that is stimulated by darkness and inhibited by light, meaning that when the neurons in your retinas send that message to your brain that they're receiving a lot of light, that inhibits the production of melatonin. It stops it or reduces it. Whereas when it's dark, during the nighttime, or when you turn all the lights out, your neurons in your retinas send the message that it's dark, and it stimulates production of melatonin by the pineal gland. Sleep regulation is overall the brain's control of switching between sleep and wakefulness, as well as coordinating this cycle with the outside world. So you could keep in mind that people in different time zones still sleep at night. So this is the brain's job of sleep regulation. It uses the SCN and the pineal gland and the hypothalamus and all of those tools at its disposal to keep you on a schedule. Finally, you see the picture of the night owl and an early bird. Whether you're a night owl or an early bird is considered your chronotype. Chrono meaning time. Your chronotype is if you function better staying up late and sleeping in late, or going to bed early and waking up early. I'm somewhat of an early bird myself. Okay, let's talk about two kinds of sleep disruptions, and then we'll go over the little chart of sleep needs. Two major types of sleep disruptions are jet lag and shift work. Jet lag is defined as a collection of symptoms that result from the mismatch between our internal circadian cycles and our environment. So when you travel, now these circadian cycles that your brain has been working so hard to build up and to practice are getting disrupted. They're all mixed up because now you're in a different time zone with different schedules of light and dark. This can cause fatigue, sluggishness, irritability, and insomnia. Rotating shift work is also a huge problem for sleep. This is a work schedule that changes, right? Some people work night shifts some days and day shifts other days. This can be really dangerous, very bad for sleep, for circadian rhythms, and it can cause depression, anxiety, exhaustion, agitation. And it's really not a good thing as an employer to rotate your employees' shifts like this, because then they come to work all agitated and exhausted and they don't do a good job. Over on the right side, we can see a chart of sleep needs by age. If you're 16 to 17 years old, you should be getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. Young adults, 18 to 25, should get 7 to 9, as well as older adults. So most likely you're requiring 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. I hope that you're getting that, because if not, you can develop a sleep deficit. Let's talk about sleep deprivation. That's when we really get a great amount of sleep debt and you're not getting enough sleep on a chronic basis. You can develop sleep deprivation, which is obviously not a good thing. A sleep rebound is when a sleep-deprived individual falls asleep more quickly later. So if you stay up for an entire night or you only sleep 1 or 2 hours, the following night you probably fall asleep quite quickly because you're tired. This is called sleep rebound. Research does show that the most severe effects of sleep deprivation occur when a person either stays awake for more than 24 hours or gets less than 4 hours of sleep for repeated nights in a row, right? Repeated nights with fewer than 4 hours of sleep. This is when you the sleep deprivation kicks in. After staying awake for 48 consecutive hours, one may start to hallucinate. If we look at the picture, we can see all of the different negative effects of sleep deprivation. Lots of psychological effects like irritability, cognitive impairment, memory loss, impaired moral judgment even, hallucinations. Your immune system becomes weakened. You become at risk of diabetes and heart disease. You have an increased reaction time, which would make you a dangerous driver for sure. Decreased accuracy, tremors and aches, growth suppression, obesity, lots of negative effects of sleep deprivation. So it's really important to get a good amount of sleep. And in fact, research suggests that sleep deprivation can affect your cognitive and motor function as much or more than alcohol intoxication. So that's saying somebody who's sleep deprived will be more affected, more impaired than somebody who's drunk. So think about that. You wouldn't want somebody who's drunk driving a car or teaching your class or performing your surgery or fighting a fire or any of those things. So we certainly don't want sleep deprived people doing that either. And that's why we'll talk about in another chapter with stress reducing. It's so important in our jobs that we get enough sleep and rest time and downtime so we can do our jobs properly. All right, here's the big question. Why do we need sleep? I'll give you a little spoiler. There's not really an answer. We don't really know. After all of these decades of sleep research, we still don't really know why human beings or even other animals need sleep. But let's discuss some possible hypotheses and if they're looking good or not. The first hypothesis is that sleep is essential to restore the resources that are expended during the day. This makes sense. All day long, you're using your energy and your emotions and your thinking and all of your thought processes and your physical processes, so you would need to rest up at night, sort of recharge like your phone. It makes sense, but all the research that tried to prove this did not support it. The hypotheses were not supported. So let's move on to another hypothesis. Our sleep patterns have evolved as an adaptive response to predatory risks, which increase in darkness. So this hypothesis also makes sense. It's saying that when we were evolving as humans back in, let's say, caveman days, we needed to hide out all night long to avoid the scary predators. We don't have the ability to defend ourselves in the dark. We can't even see in the dark. So humans and other animals would hide in caves all night long, escaping the predators. And what are you going to do if you're in a cave all night long? Just go to sleep. There's nothing else to do. So again, makes sense, totally logical. However, they've researched it, and in fact, it's not true. The research shows no relationship or even an inverse relationship between predation risk and time spent sleeping. What this means is animals with a bigger risk of being eaten would likely hide more and sleep more. But this was found to be not true. In fact, some of the animals at the top of the food chain sleep the most. So this one didn't make sense. Moving on to the green hypothesis. Sleep serves no single universally adaptive function. Different species have evolved different patterns of sleep in response to their unique evolutionary pressures. So this is saying we cannot answer the question in general, why do we sleep? We being all humans and animals. We need to look at each species and say, why do giraffes sleep? Why do skunks sleep? Why do humans sleep? Right? One species at a time. This could make sense because different species sleep different amounts, but they haven't really been able to make sense of it. Why do sloths sleep so much more than giraffes? Right? We need to study this a little bit more. There needs to be more research done, but they have found that there are a lot of health benefits to sleeping. So moving on to the purple hypothesis, sleep is important for cognitive function and memory formation. This one seems to make the most sense. Again, it hasn't been proven, but it does have quite a bit of evidence supporting this hypothesis. For example, sleep deprivation results in disruptions in cognition and memory deficits. And these impairments become more severe as the amount of sleep deprivation increases. So this suggests that if we didn't sleep at all, we wouldn't really have any cognition or memory. As well, slow wave sleep after learning a new task can actually improve your performance on that task. So if you learn something new and then you sleep and you get slow wave sleep time, when you wake up, you'll do better on the task. It's like it's solidified in your mind while you were sleeping. It seems essential for memory formation, and without sleeping, perhaps we wouldn't be able to form memories, which would certainly not be helpful evolutionarily. So, and also getting the optimal amount of sleep has been associated with other cognitive benefits. So it seems like perhaps the answer is just kind of that, why do we sleep? Because our brains were designed to need it, is possibly the answer here. But again, we don't have a proven answer. All right, sleep cycles. I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but I wanted to get all the sleep cycle stuff onto one slide, and I think we can do it. Let's start with stage 1 sleep. This is right when you're falling asleep, the transitional stage between wakefulness and sleep. During this time, there's a slowdown in your breathing and your heartbeat, and it's characterized by alpha waves and then theta waves. If you notice, the alpha waves are low frequency, high amplitude, and then theta waves, even lower frequency, higher amplitude. So stage 1 sleep is right when you're falling off to sleep. It's the easiest to wake somebody up during stage 1. And in fact, if you only made it to stage 1 and somebody wakes you up, you may not even think you fell asleep. Moving on to stage 2. During stage 2 sleep, the body goes into a state of deep relaxation. This is kind of when you really fall asleep. It's still mostly dominated by the theta waves from the stage 1 sleep, but it's interrupted by 2 different things, one called sleep spindles and one called K complexes. Sleep spindles are rapid bursts of higher frequency brainwaves that might be important to learning and memory. And K complexes are very high amplitude patterns of brain activity that may occur in response to environmental stimuli. It could possibly be things that are happening around you while you're sleeping that trigger the K complexes. We're still learning a lot about sleep. You can see in the picture underneath the stage 2 part, it shows you what a sleep spindle and a K complex looks like. So again, I don't know if I mentioned this. What we're looking at here, these blue lines, is an EEG. It's the electrical activity of somebody's brain while they're sleeping. It does not tell us where the activity occurs in the brain. It just tells us the overall level of activity going on, which is all we need to know for this kind of research. Stage 3 sleep, moving on. So stage 1 is your transition, you're falling asleep. Stage 2, you get into that deep relaxation, mostly theta waves, but those little bursts of sleep spindles and K complexes. On to stage 3 sleep. This is referred to as deep sleep, or that slow wave sleep I was talking about when our memories are formed. This is characterized by low frequency, high amplitude delta waves. During this time, your heart rate and breathing really slow down. This is the real deep, true sleep. Your slow wave sleep when you form your memories and all that. Finally, stage 4 is referred to as REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movements. This is mostly marked by the rapid movements of the eyes. The brain waves associated with this stage of sleep are interestingly very similar to when somebody's awake. So the waves in your brain look similar to the activity in your brain looks very similar to when you're awake during REM sleep. You have the rapid eye movements, and this is where dreaming occurs. All of our dreaming happens during the REM stage of sleep. Interestingly, it's also associated with paralysis of muscle systems in the body, with the exception of those that make circulation and respiration possible. So your arms and legs and neck and all of that is actually paralyzed during REM sleep, and that's why you don't go walking around the room when you're walking around in your dream. There's something that we don't touch on in this topic, in this chapter, called sleep paralysis, which maybe we'll discuss at another time because it is quite interesting. But anyhow, REM sleep, rapid eye movements, dreaming, similar brain waves to when you're awake, and paralyzed muscles. Although there is a sleep disorder we'll discuss in a little bit where the people's muscles don't get paralyzed in REM sleep and they kick and punch all around while they're sleeping, which can be dangerous. One more look at some graphs of our sleep. So we can see at the top in red in the graph on the left is what our brain activity looks like when we're awake. Stage 1 is while we're falling asleep. Stage 2 has those K complexes and spindles poking out in the middle. Stage 3 is our slow wave deep sleep. And then stage 4 is REM dream sleep, which looks somewhat similar to being awake. Over on the right is what we call a hypnogram. This is the diagram of stages of sleep as they occur during the period of sleep. The reason I put this is because the fact that there are 4 stages sort of makes it seem like first comes stage 1, then stage 2, then stage 3, then REM, then you wake up. But in fact, that's not true. You sort of cycle between them. So if you notice this person's hypnogram, if you read it along the bottom, starting at 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, it shows you what happened to them during the night. So they started off at awake, went to stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. They stayed in stage 3 for a while, right? They kind of go back and forth, back up to the REM. They're in REM cycle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times during the night. They go into that REM stage of sleep. So as you can see, it goes back and forth between the stages, even with some waking up during the middle of the night, as I'm sure you've noticed in yourself. Okay, that's it for sleep stages. Let's talk a little bit about dreams. I'm not going to go too into detail about dreams, but if you're interested, I have a very interesting article that explains Hobson's theory of dreams. The selective attraction model is what he calls his theory of dreams. Very interesting. Freud believed that dreams have manifest content, which is what's actually happening in the dream. Perhaps you're being chased by a dinosaur. And then the latent content is like the deeper meaning of the dream. Maybe the dinosaur represents your boss at work who you're scared of. Makes a lot of sense. Lots of fun to look into interpretation of dreams. There are still tons of books written about this because it really is fun, but it's not true. It's not a real thing. There's been so much research and none of it has supported any of this dream interpretation stuff. Carl Jung is another famous psychologist, and he believed in a collective unconscious. This is maybe even a little more out there than the dream interpretation stuff. What Jung is saying is that as a human race, we all share a collective unconscious that our brains sort of load into every night. So every night when we go to sleep and we dream, we're dreaming about the things that other humans have experienced all over the world. We're sharing an unconscious with them. Also, as you may have guessed, this has not been supported at all by research. Rosalind Cartwright was another researcher who says that our dreams are basically showing what we think about the most during the day. She did a study that found in divorced women, those who thought about their ex-husbands more often during the day dreamed about them more at night, right? They found a relationship to what you're thinking about during the day and what you're dreaming about at night. There is some support for this. Seems like there's more support for Hobson's theory, which we don't really cover in this chapter, but again, I have a very interesting article. Please email me if you would like to read it. It's not required, but it is interesting. Maybe I'll post it anyway, just for fun. And interestingly, Hobson believed that there were these certain key dream characteristics, like accepting strangeness and intense emotions, illogical content. Not really all that important, just cool to know that there is somebody with a theory of dreams that seems to be holding up a little bit to research. And what Hobson is basically saying is that we have all of this firing of neurons that's going on in our brains. Our brains want to make sense of it. So while we're sleeping, the neurons are firing and our brain tries to make sense of it by putting it into sort of a storyline. Moving on from dreams to sleep problems and disorders, I find this slide very interesting. You've probably heard of insomnia, which is a difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep at least 3 nights a week for at least 1 month's time. So you may say, oh, I have insomnia when you can't fall asleep. To actually have insomnia, it needs to happen at least 3 nights a week for at least a month. Normally, this will happen for years. There are several treatments, and in fact, the book does discuss different treatments for these disorders if you're interested. Another sleep disorder is called somnambulism. I believe that's how it's pronounced, somnambulism, or sleepwalking. I know several people who've suffered from this, and it can actually be pretty scary because you don't remember anything in the morning. My friend's mom used to wake up in the middle of the night and eat foods she was allergic to. It was really scary. So sleepwalking can involve behaviors ranging from walking around to driving a car. During periods of sleepwalking, the sleepers have their eyes open often, but they're not responsive to communicate with them. They won't wake up, they won't talk to you, but they'll just go about doing their thing. I had a student a while back who the family had to put an alarm in their house because he would leave the house in the middle of the night and go wandering down the street while he was asleep. Sleepwalking can be a big problem, but as I mentioned, the book does talk about treatments for all of these disorders. That most of them are treated with medication since we sort of understand what's going on in the brain to cause them. REM, sleep behavior disorder, or RBD, that's the one I was talking about earlier, where the muscle paralysis that you're supposed to have during REM sleep does not happen. So when people dream about scary things or they dream that they're fighting or running, they may flail about in their sleep and punch and kick and hit. And in fact, there are people who get quite injured by their partner doing this in the middle of the night. Moving on to restless leg syndrome. This might sound silly by the name, but it is a real thing and it responds to medication. It's an uncomfortable sensation in your legs during periods of inactivity or when you're trying to fall asleep. And it only gets better when you move your legs on purpose, when you move them all around or walk around. Next is night terrors. These are characterized by fear or panic. The person seems to be awake, sort of like a sleepwalker, but they won't remember it and they won't respond to you and they don't really know what's going on. Although sometimes they'll respond, but they don't remember it. I'm familiar with night terrors because both of my children suffered from them at 4 years old. It's very common, I found out, for 4-year-olds to suffer from night terrors. They often outgrow it, as both of my kids did. But man, before I understood it, it was pretty scary when my 4-year-old came shrieking into my room at night, screaming and yelling, and wasn't responding to me. It can be quite scary. The last one in the chart is sleep apnea. There are 2 types of sleep apnea. First, let's define general sleep apnea, which are episodes during which a sleeper's breathing stops. The episodes can last 10 to 20 seconds or longer and are often associated with brief periods of arousal. So they stop breathing and then they sort of like wake up for a second because they can't breathe, right? And then they catch their breath. There's 2 types of sleep apnea: obstructive sleep apnea and central sleep apnea. They're caused by 2 different things but result in the same effect. Obstructive sleep apnea is when something in your throat or in your respiratory system actually blocks the breathing, right? This can often happen with overweight people. It depends on the way that your position that you're sleeping in. Something is physically blocking you from breathing. Whereas central sleep apnea, there's nothing physically blocking it. The problem is the message being sent from your brain to your lungs. The message sort of gets interrupted for a little bit while you're sleeping. It's almost like you forget to breathe. Your body forgets to take a breath, and then you wake up and remember and breathe. Sleep apnea can be treated by a CPAP machine, which you can read about in the book. There's other treatments for sleep apnea as well. Very, very common. Most likely you know somebody who has sleep apnea. Underneath the chart, we'll talk a little bit about SIDS and narcolepsy. SIDS stands for sudden infant death syndrome. This is when an infant stops breathing during sleep and passes away. It's a high risk for infants under 12 months old. Boys have a greater risk than girls. There are a lot of theories about SIDS. There are no answers. That's why it's completely unexplained. Sudden infant death. They don't know what causes it. It just means that the baby passed away. Very common. As a parent, of course, it was my biggest fear when my kids were young. I followed the safe to sleep protocol, which means you leave them asleep flat on their back. No blankets, no pillows, no stuffed animals, no bumpers. Just a tight-fitted sheet on a safe crib mattress and a baby in tight-fitting pajamas lying on its back. I always did that, and luckily everything worked out for us. But even parents who do follow all of the rules sometimes do suffer from SIDS. Moving on to narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is kind of almost the opposite of insomnia. You're falling asleep at inopportune times. Someone with narcolepsy may be sitting in a meeting or at a dinner table and they just fall asleep. It's often associated with cataplexy, which is a lack of muscle tone or muscle weakness. In some cases, it involves complete paralysis of the voluntary muscles. When they fall asleep, they become like paralyzed. Narcoleptic episodes are often triggered by states of heightened arousal or stress, which is interesting to me. It's not triggered by boredom. You're not just sitting around, you're so bored you fall asleep. It's more triggered by stress or states of arousal. All right, done with our sleep problems and disorders. Wow, it's windy out there. Let's talk a little bit about substance use and abuse. The book goes into more details about all of the different drugs and how they can affect our brain. But let's talk about some basic definitions of substance use, and then we will talk about how the depressants and stimulants actually affect our neurons in our brain. So physical dependence are changes in normal bodily functions that cause a drug user to experience withdrawal symptoms upon cessation of use. Right? So if you're physically dependent on a drug, it means you have withdrawal symptoms when you stop using it. Cigarettes are a perfect example of this. People who smoke cigarettes easily develop a physical dependence. They're physically addictive. So are many other drugs, but in a lot of cases, the psychological component is the bigger issue, so to speak. Interestingly, I learned recently that the only drug that is life-threatening to go through withdrawal from, right? So the only drug that can actually die from withdrawal is alcohol. So you may have heard how terrible the withdrawal symptoms are from heroin or other opiates, and that is true. Those people feel like they're going to die, but they're not going to die. Withdrawing from alcohol can actually kill you. So real alcoholics who are drinking every day and are deciding to quit should do so under a doctor's supervision. I didn't know this until recently. I thought I would share. Moving on, psychological dependence means an emotional rather than a physical need for the drug. Drugs are often used, or pretty much always used, to relieve psychological distress. The video that we watched for our discussion question talks about this quite a bit. Moving on to tolerance. Tolerance means requiring increased quantities of a drug to obtain the desired effect. This happens a lot with heroin users. They use a small amount at first, and then it takes more and more and more of the drug to give them that same feeling. Finally, withdrawal, we just talked about, are the negative symptoms experienced when drug use is discontinued. I have seen videos of people withdrawing from drugs, and it certainly does not look fun. Let's look at the chart on the right side. It just sort of classifies well-known drugs as either stimulants, sedatives, opiates, or hallucinogens. So stimulants increase your heart rate and your blood pressure. Everything's increased, makes you alert and not hungry and not sleepy and all of that. Some stimulants include cocaine, amphetamines, including ADHD meds like Adderall, methamphetamines, and MDMA. There's other ones, even caffeine is a stimulant. Sedatives or depressants include alcohol, barbiturates, and benzodiazepines. I always have trouble saying that, like Xanax, anti-anxiety meds like Xanax. These things calm you down. They result in decreased heart rate, decreased blood pressure, relaxation, decreased inhibitions, more sleep. It can cause motor problems, right? You wouldn't want to drive a car when under the influence of any of these for sure. Moving on to opiates. Well-known opiates include opium, heroin, fentanyl, morphine, oxycodone, all the stuff they give you at the hospital, plus heroin. Effects on the body of opiates include it does help with pain, right? But it can also decrease your appetite and cause all sorts of other issues like respiratory problems and things like that. Finally, hallucinogens actually include marijuana, interestingly, as well as LSD and peyote and all of those other PCP and ketamine and those hallucinogens that you may have heard of that we should definitely stay away from. They can cause increased heart rate and blood pressure, mild perceptual changes. Really depends on the drug here. You can read more about these in your book if you're interested. Let's talk about how the depressants and stimulants actually affect our neurons. In the last chapter, we learned about the function of neurons and how the dendrites have these little channel, or the dendrites have the little spaces for the neurotransmitters to bind to. Now, drugs can act like neurotransmitters, and they can go into the receptors and bind, pretending or mimicking to be the neurotransmitter, and that's what causes the effects. So for depressants, what happens actually is there's this chlorine channel. So normally when we talked about the charge of the neuron, we talked about the positive sodium ions coming into the neuron and increasing the charge, right? Remember, it had to get to that action potential. So it brought the charge up from its resting potential to a positive charge, which caused the action potential. What depressants do is they actually open up a chloride ion gate. And the chloride ions come in and make the cell even more negative than it already was. So it makes it even harder to achieve that action potential. So basically, if the neurons are firing too much, you can introduce a depressant, which will cause them to fire less, right? It brings it even that much more negative, making it so much harder to hit that threshold of excitation and go into the action potential. So some depressants include alcohol or different drugs that you can take. And as you can see, they fit right into those little receptors, which open up the chloride gates and cause the neuron to become very negatively charged, making it much harder to reach that action potential. Moving over to stimulants, it kind of does the opposite. Well, actually, in this case, what it's doing is it's blocking the reuptake. So when your body releases something called dopamine, which is sort of a feel-good neurotransmitter that the presynaptic cell is sending to the dendrites of the postsynaptic cell, what the cocaine does is it stops it from reuptake. So after they send those neurotransmitters over to the postsynaptic cell and they go into the receptors, and there's leftover ones that are supposed to get sucked back into the presynaptic cell, instead the cocaine or the other stimulant will block it from being brought back into the original cell, leaving it to just float around and wait till it can bond again to the receptors of the postsynaptic cell. So it blocks the reuptake of dopamine, sort of like we had mentioned in the last chapter with the reuptake inhibitors. Moving on, we are almost done. Let's talk real quick about hypnosis and meditation. Hypnosis is a state of extreme self-focus and attention in which minimal attention is given to external stimuli. Hypnosis is something that sounds like it's not true, I think. I think it sounds a little out there, sounds a little nuts. But I actually took an entire class on hypnosis during my undergrad, and it turns out that hypnosis can be very, very useful. In fact, they've performed surgeries on people under hypnosis without any anesthetic. Hypnosis has been proven to reduce certain kinds of warts. It makes the warts just disappear. Only certain kinds, but of those kinds of warts, it works. Hypnosis does not work for things like smoking or weight loss. This is kind of the money-making side of it. It can work to recover memories. This gets a little bit tricky because of false recovered memories. If you're interested in hypnosis, definitely send me an email because I do have lots of information, but this chapter doesn't really focus on it too much. So let's move on. Meditation is the clearing of the mind in order to achieve a state of relaxed awareness and focus. So the girl is meditating on the beach. A big difference between hypnosis and meditation is that hypnosis is done by a certified hypnotherapist, whereas meditation is usually done alone, or you may be trained by somebody, but it's sort of a you thing. I believe that is it. Let's do our summary. Feel free to turn the video off and come back to the summary later if you'd like. I'll go nice and quick, starting with consciousness, our awareness of internal and external stimuli. Internal stimuli include pain, hunger, thirst, sleepiness, thoughts, and emotions. External stimuli include light, warmth, hearing voices or sounds. Sleep is a state marked by relatively low levels of physical activity and reduced sensory awareness that is distinct from periods of rest. Wakefulness is characterized by high levels of sensory awareness, thought, and behavior. Biological rhythms are internal rhythms of biological activity. Circadian rhythms are biological rhythms that take place over 24 hours. The SCN, or the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is the area of the hypothalamus in which the body's biological clock is located. This means a 24-hour biological clock. Sleep regulation is brain's control of switching between sleep and wakefulness, as well as coordinating this cycle with the outside world. Melatonin is an important regulator of sleep-wake cycles. It's a hormone released by the pineal gland and stimulated by darkness and inhibited by light. They do make melatonin like gummies or pills that you can take that supposedly help you fall asleep as well. But your body should be, if you have a good circadian rhythm, producing a good amount of melatonin on its own. Next is sleep debt. Sleep debt is the result of insufficient sleep on a chronic basis. It builds up over time. Sleep rebound is when sleep-deprived individuals experience, and they have an easier time falling back asleep. They worded this kind of weird, but sleep rebound just means that when you're real tired, you fall asleep quickly. Stage 1 sleep is the transitional phase that occurs between wakefulness and sleep, alpha and theta waves during stage 1. Stage 2 sleep, the body goes into deeper relaxation, theta waves broken up by sleep spindles and K complexes. Stage 3 sleep is your real deep sleep. This is called the slow wave sleep. Whoops, I didn't mean that hashtag in there. This is called our slow wave sleep. This is when memories are built and learning is solidified. During this, we have the low frequency, high amplitude delta waves. And finally, stage 4 or REM sleep is characterized by rapid eye movements, dreaming, and muscle paralysis. And during REM sleep, our brain waves are similar to when we're awake. Over to the right side, we talk about Freud's ideas about dreaming. Manifest content is the storyline of the dream, and latent content is the hidden meaning. Carl Jung believed that we have a collective unconscious, which is a theoretical repository of information shared by all people across cultures. So when you're dreaming, it's because we're sharing this unconscious with all other humans. Remember, Freud and Jung were both not able to substantiate their hypotheses at all. There was no evidence supporting their hypotheses about this. Rosalind Cartwright says that dreams simply reflect the life events that are important to the dreamer. Whereas Alan Hobson, he has his activation synthesis theory of dreaming. I think I may have said it backwards when we were on the dreaming slide. His theory is called activation synthesis theory of dreaming, Alan Hobson. He says that dreamings are the result of our brain attempting to synthesize the neural activity during REM sleep. So the neurons are firing like crazy in our brain, and our brain wants to make sense of it, is why Hobson believes that we dream. Insomnia is the first of our disorders we'll discuss. Insomnia is a consistent difficulty in falling or staying asleep for at least 3 nights a week over a month's time. A parasomnia is a sleep disorder characterized by unwanted, disruptive motor activity or experiences during sleep. So parasomnias are all those other ones we talked about. I don't think I used the word parasomnia earlier, but it's all the other sleep disorders other than insomnia. So some parasomnias include sleepwalking, RBD, sleep apnea, restless legs, all of that. Sleepwalking is also called somnambulism. It's a sleep disorder when the sleeper does complex behaviors at night while they're sleeping. The RBD or REM sleep behavior disorder is where you don't have the muscle paralysis during REM sleep, and the sleepers have high levels of physical activity during this time. Central sleep apnea is interrupted breathing due to a disruption in the signals sent from the brain, whereas obstructive sleep apnea is the sleep disorder defined by episodes when breathing stops as a result of a blockage in the airway, right? So both types of sleep apnea have breathing that stops, but central is because of a disruption in the signal sent from the brain, and obstructive is because of an actual blockage in the airway. Sudden infant death syndrome, known as SIDS, is when an infant stops breathing during the night and passes away unexplainably. Narcolepsy is falling asleep at inopportune times, associated with cataplexy. And remember, it can be triggered by stressful events or times. A stimulant is a drug that increases neural activity. It can include caffeine, nicotine, amphetamines, and cocaine. A depressant is a drug that tends to suppress the nervous system activity. And an opiate or an opioid is a drug that has a strong analgesic property, so pain-killing properties, the opioids. This can include heroin, morphine, methadone, and codeine. As the video will mention, we're given opiates if we undergo surgery at the hospital, but not all of us become addicts afterwards. And that's one very interesting point about that video. I didn't have room to fit every single definition in here, so it can't hurt to review them at the end of the chapter in your textbook.